It's better for the UN to be than not to be, depending on who you ask. It's doubtful it should make any difference to the children of Yemen or Palestine, to those who've heard no whisper of human rights as they waste away in hunger from a persisting war. A key reason for the UN's failure to protect human rights is politicization, according to many human rights activists. Iran was itself a victim of this during the imposed 8-year war of the 1980s with Baathist Iraq. And today the country is singly afflicted by harshest ever US sanctions while sharing in the global fight with the coronavirus. Regardless, the United Nations Human Rights Council is currently holding its 46th regular session in Geneva, and it will go on until March 23, 2021. And for March the 9th, the general debate was set to be held with an interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. Human rights and Iran make for a controversial combination in the eyes of the many. But those accusing Iran of human rights abuses often have themselves dark records. In any case, Iran doesn't seem to have a problem answering for itself, and we are here to see how far this country has evolved in regard to human rights and where it's headed. I'm Leila Faromarzi, and you're watching Iran Today. Human rights are a common good that contribute to human solidarity, without which it would be impossible to nurture empathy and to shield human rights from infringements and transgressions. This Esmail Baghai Hamane said at last year's event. He's Iran's permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva. Mr. Eghbali, PhD in international law, works for the Judiciary's Research Center. As he gives us his opinion on matters, he also says a little something on his work.
Well, if we want to consider human rights in the general sense, there are examples that every human being must have by nature to be able to live a free and more prosperous life. Its examples are also different. The first generation deals with civil and political rights, the second generation is about economic, social and cultural rights, and the third generation concerns rights such as the right to development, self-determination and having a healthy environment. In fact, it's a whole unit, but at the same time, it's divided into different components.
Given how the Islamic Republic of Iran and international law seem to find themselves at odds with one another, it is easy to assume that could stem from a difference between a Western understanding of human rights and an Islamic one. Mr. Parkain, a former ambassador of long standing, explains.
In the West, human rights are based on humanism, the originality of human beings, which became very prominent after the French Revolution. Afterwards, man replaced God. Because of the conflicts that the intellectuals had with the church at the time, they replaced God with the man, and said that it's the man who can give power to others. Therefore, the philosophy of humanism took shape, which gave birth to liberal democracy. According to principles of liberal democracy, human beings are free to do whatever they want, with no conditions whatsoever. In the divine religions, including Islam, people enjoy many rights, but there are limitations that are innate and are related to the specific nature of human beings and their inner characteristics.
The United Nations formation was primarily supposed to be to prevent wars and to protect human rights, but instead, big powers, particularly the US, use it to serve their own narrow interests. Example, America has exercised its power of veto countless times in protecting the Israeli oppression of Palestine, its illegally continued settlement building. As Hamane put it, the current international climate is obsessively hostile to nurturing genuine human solidarity to protect and promote the common good. Ironically, human rights are the main casualty of today's international relations. Given the international community, as we call it, is pointing a finger at Iran, what has Iran done to improve human rights matters? You must wonder what happened to our political, non-political prisoners. Iran has resolved a lot of issues, but when there's a warlike domestic atmosphere between political factions, partisanship tends to interpret everything as a security issue. Mr. Abu Torabi is on the Human Rights Committee of Parliament. He tells of how Iranian law has been amended to fit with the international expectation.
Especially now, one of the positive moves made with regards to the constitution was the addition of political crime to it. In a recently enacted political crime, we allow a political offender to have a jury. We let the political offender, if convicted, have the right to have family visitors on a daily basis. Solitary confinement has no place anymore. We don't have solitary confinement for a political criminal. There are great achievements that most countries in the world are yet to enjoy.
In such murky waters, anyone can easily use accusation and false labels, such as spying, for instance, to gain personal advantages. In the face of foreign threats, the leader Ayatollah Khamenei has urged a unified voice among officials and people alike. Iranian authorities do not claim that Iran has been perfect in terms of human rights. That is a claim no country can make, actually. And in an effort between the three powers, laws are being amended or considered for amendment, such as laws on citizenship rights. I'll let an expert comment on that, of course.
In the Islamic Republic of Iran, the issue of individual freedom is well seen in Article 27 of the Constitution. Freedom of expression and the press within the framework of the law is well enacted, and now we see how much criticism is directed at everyone, even our country's top officials, including the leader of the Islamic Revolution. As we have seen in video clips, people who visit him easily express their opinions. The same goes for the president and government officials and members of the parliament.
Over the years, Iran has tried to improve on a variety of issues. Those include prisoners' rights, the right to prohibit torture and arbitrary detention, the right to health, to education, women's rights, children's rights, the right to freedom of expression and access to information, the right to freedom of political association, trade unions and community organizations, also the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and to self-determination, the right of people with disabilities, the right to adequate housing, the rights of asylum seekers and immigrants, and of religious minorities, and freedom of belief and religion.
I'm saying this confidently, that you can't find any country in the world where all minorities are required to be represented in the parliament. In Iran, we must have one Jewish lawmaker, 2 Christians, and 1 Zoroastrian parliament member, according to their population. You do not have such a thing in France right now. Most European Muslims are in France, but they do not have laws that require 1 or 2 representatives to be Muslim. Of course, if Muslims vote and participate, they can be elected. But Iran's law requires some lawmakers to be representing the Jewish, Christians, and Zoroastrians.
As for how successful these efforts have been, we can say with confidence that regardless of the outcome, there is an ongoing rigorous debate among Iranian authorities and people about how the ideals of the revolution have not yet been reached. It is understood that more work, sacrifice and effort lies ahead to attain the exemplary standards of social justice based on the teachings of Islam and great Iranian traditions.
The right to education is also amongst these rights. It means that governments are obliged to provide the necessary facilities for citizens to have access to an appropriate education. In the same context, the right to education has been considered in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. For example, we can refer to Article 30 of the Constitution, which emphasizes free and public education. In this regard, we now see that in our development program, the issue of education has always been emphasized. For example, in the 12th part of the 6th Development Plan, there is again a section dedicated to public and higher education.
Human rights efforts and achievements of the Islamic Republic of Iran have mostly been commended by the international community in recent years. The UN Human Rights Council itself last year paid Iran a compliment in its periodic review of this country's human rights record. The preliminary debate on the report featured lengthy praise for the Islamic Republic. 95 out of 111 countries that took the floor lauded Iran for its human rights, according to UN Watch. That's a Geneva-based non-profit organization.
For example, I would like to say that now in the discussion related to the judiciary, one of the issues that should be considered is facilitating the possibility of people with disabilities to use judicial facilities. Now, whether the courtroom space is such that they can use it effectively, both in court and in the courtroom, facilities should be provided so that they are more accessible. In general, many measures have been taken. For example, if you look at the buildings of the judiciary, you will see that they're designed so that a person with a disability can move around easily. As for court appearances, there have been many cases where a person who had speech impediments or other problems was granted assistance to speak more easily and be able to defend themselves.
Iran's High Council for Human Rights said that the amendment of the law on the punishment of drug traffickers in 2017 had reduced the death penalty by 90%, and steps had been taken to strengthen the independence of judges, access to lawyers, and fair trial. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. There's plenty more to be said, but it's time to give other media outlets a chance. To see what they have to say, I invite you indoors. Here's what they actually say, beginning with Global Times. Washington ill-prepared to set human rights agenda. Now that Biden is in power, we are likely to hear strong rhetoric on human rights coming out of the White House and the State Department. We will observe multiple human rights-focused U.S. initiatives in international organizations. And we will also see new American human rights-related sanctions against Moscow and Beijing. Moreover, the reality is that Washington is ill-prepared to make a convincing case on human rights and broader democracy issues. First, America itself has not fully recovered from a deep and protracted political crisis. Many inside the US still question the standards of November's presidential elections, as well as the legitimacy of information restrictions imposed on Donald Trump and his supporters by major social networks and the US mainstream liberal media. The 2020 large-scale violent racial riots also question the assumption that the United States can serve today as a universal model of human rights observance. Until President Biden fixes related problems at home, his international human rights crusade will not look too credible, even for his fellow citizens. Iran's judiciary puts in a word on US human rights, as pointed to in Ahlul Bayt. Iran's judiciary chief blasts US human rights claims as power show. Today we see that the Americans who claim to be advocates of human rights are trampling on the rights of nations in just a show of power, Raisi said, addressing judiciary officials in Tehran. He added that the Americans attack the resistance centers in Syria and at the same time single out Iran for giving death penalty to drug traffickers as a human rights concern, noting that they extort money from the Saudis and claim that justice has been served, while they have not been seen to do justice so far. They violate the rights, trample on justice, and oppress the rights-seeking people, but claim to be advocates of human rights, while the world's people know them well and are no longer deceived, and know that Americans are violating the rights and are disloyal. Raisi had also earlier condemned Washington's systematic violation of Iranians' rights, and said the US allies are the #1 violators of human rights in the world. What does human rights mean to the West? The Global Times quotes, "Human rights used by West countries as tool of political manipulation," said the Chinese ambassador to the UN. Certain Western countries do not truly care about Xinjiang residents' lives, but simply want to use human rights as an excuse to meddle in China's internal affairs, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said Thursday, urging these countries to reflect on their own slaughter of indigenous people and tackle existing racism and other human rights problems. They should reserve the hat of genocide for themselves, ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said at a routine press conference. And that would be the news segment. Back to the narration. With a suffering economy and mismanagement, making ends meet has become back-breaking to Iranians. Albeit, China said it commends Iran's efforts to eradicate poverty, enhance social security, protect the rights of vulnerable groups, and that it hopes Iran will continue to drive economic and social development to provide a solid basis for the enjoyment of all human rights. Also, Iran's efforts to provide for refugees despite the challenges it faced and the measures to empower women, promote school enrollment, and reduce infant mortality were acknowledged.
40% of employees in Iran are women, and more than 50% of those admitted to universities are females. More than 50% of the medical staff are women. Women in Iran are employed in all jobs. We have several women in the cabinet. We had a minister, we had a vice president. We may have laws to protect families and women, but we have difficulty enforcing them. One argument says the authorities should try to implement this, but the authorities might not always have the jurisdiction. In some cases, the implementation of the laws depends on the family members.
Syria said at the debate, "We commend Iran's active efforts to increase healthcare services by building medical care in rural and urban areas." Several speakers noted that unilateral sanctions were harmful to the promotion of human rights, especially given the ongoing need to combat COVID-19. Among those recognizing the difficulties in this fight and pledging their assistance to Iran, Russia praised this country's cooperation with human rights treaty bodies and its openness for dialogue.
We are a party to many human rights conventions, the most important of which are the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There are two conventions in which membership brings an obligation for each country. Well, in this context, the judiciary, as one of the three branches of the country, has a duty to fulfill the obligations related to these covenants as much as possible. Our country's courts are also obliged to respect these obligations.
Developing countries are traditionally scapegoated for human rights violations. Yet, Iran became a major supporter of the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. Hamaneh said in last year's UNHRC review session that Iran had always examined all recommendations with an open mind and a spirit of cooperation. However, certain recommendations could not be noted as they amounted to repeated allegations and biased propositions. From 1986, the UN Human Rights Council has consistently appointed a Special Rapporteur for Iran. But the appointment, according to Iranian officials, is not based purely on legal objectives, but on political objectives of just a few countries in the Human Rights Council.
Because international law is the product of the opinions given by all countries, it's relatively fair. But hegemonic Western countries use human rights as political tools. That is, if they have good relations with a country, if their interests are served by that country, they will not raise the issue of human rights at all. But if they want to put pressure on another country that opposes them, they will use human rights.
The Iranian Bar Association has consulted various individuals and assessed reports by the Special Rapporteur, Javid Rehman. Some cases had been prepared based on incorrect information and reliance on unofficial sources, and that almost all of his report was a repetition of his previous claims, which are also available on the websites of well-known opponents of the Islamic Republic of Iran who are associated with certain intelligence services. This has undermined the credibility of his report in official circles here.
Today, human rights have become a political tool in the hands of the world powers to pressure the Islamic Republic. Today, there is no such thing as democracy and ballot box in countries like Saudi Arabia. But look how they are supporting Saudi Arabia. Look how Saudi Arabia slaughtered Khashoggi with a hacksaw, but they didn't target Saudis with any punishment for it. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemeni schools and hospitals every day in violation of all international law. They don't condemn Saudi Arabia for killing children in Yemen. That is why we say that's a double standard and that human rights have become politicized and become the political tool for the world powers.
On this matter, Ali Bagheri Kani, head of the Iranian judiciary's High Council for Human Rights, stressed that there is no expert view on the issue of human rights in the mentioned report. In every part of the report are the views of Western powers that are in conflict with the policies and approaches of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We protest the political and discriminatory abuse of human rights mechanisms, he said. In the past, overt interference in other countries' internal affairs has been used by the US as a tool to maintain its hegemonic status. Now, whatever the situation in Iran, perhaps again this country's human rights record is about to be used by the Biden administration as a bargaining chip in getting to adapt rather than revive a troubled nuclear deal. To repeat, US Secretary of State Blinken claims his government is committed to safeguarding human rights of all people because they're universal values. But Donald Trump was also a US president till very recently, and it was he that withdrew the US from the UN Human Rights Council in 2018, claiming that the council wasn't acting favorably enough towards Israel. And the Biden administration hasn't yet returned to the UNHR Council.
Consider those who sponsor human rights resolutions, such as Canada. Canada treats its natives the worst. Australia has a group called the Aboriginal people. These are indigenous people, as you probably know. In order for people to come and watch them as if they are in a museum, they still keep the Aboriginals in a state of barbarism to earn some money. They claim to be defenders of human rights. The United States is committing crimes against people of color. Look how they burned the Davidic sect and the Europe's NATO that committed so many crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Europe supports the crimes of the Israeli regime against the Palestinians. They back the child-killing regime of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
The United States faced its first review in 5 years at the UN's main human rights body with the detentions of migrant children and the killings of unarmed black people during the Trump administration's tenure, among other issues high on minds. AP reported this in November 2020. Friendlier countries called for the US to ratify various treaties aimed at guaranteeing human rights, but they expressed concerns that racial inequalities and discrimination, gun violence, and the use of the death penalty in the US.
Look how much human rights were violated in the case of people of color due to Trump's racist actions and support for racism. This was a heavy blow to the Western culture's identity. The same goes for Europe. This is what is happening in France, and the crimes committed by NATO as the flag bearer of peace in Afghanistan and Iraq. These all have raised questions about human rights in the West. Now Europe and the United States have lost their identities in this regard. The basic principles of the French Revolution have now been violated.
The American Civil Liberties Union has called the government's report one of the worst attempts to cover up US human rights violations since the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. The Chinese representative Jiang Duan cited namely systematic racism, politicization of the COVID-19 pandemic, the proliferation of guns, and military interventions abroad that left civilians dead. Stop interfering for political reasons in other countries' internal affairs under the pretext of human rights, he said.
Iran is one of the countries that has taken the best steps with regards to freedom. It has made good progress. Look at the United States recently, or even the countries that claim to be the cradle of democracy. I cite France as an example. Look how the French police treat people. They even have discussed a law that prohibits journalists from publishing interviews with people protesting in the streets. This is while our law permits this. People are free in these matters in Iran.
Earlier in February, Ayatollah Khamenei said the domineering order has always looked for excuses against the Islamic Revolution. One day it's human rights, once vilifying theocracy, once the nuclear issue, and once regional issues. They're all excuses. The key concern is that Iran won't give in to their domination. That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Don't forget to return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's going to be on. And we are waiting for your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.